Today, we are discussing the Autumn Budget Memoranda, which include the final changes occurring in this fiscal year 2025. Within the framework of the Parliament's budgetary rights, it is of course important that such changes during the fiscal year, which were not yet approved by this Parliament during the discussion of the 2025 budget, are still submitted for notification and approval. Windfalls and setbacks are, in principle, settled within the budget of the relevant department during the fiscal year. That is the rule. However, when reading the Autumn Budget Memorandum, I noticed, if I am not mistaken, that it also seems possible in practice to shift money between different departments. For example, on page 49 of the Autumn Budget Memorandum, we read the following: that 20 million euros was transferred from the Ministry of Defense to the Netherlands Organization for Scientific Research, NWO. This organization falls under the Ministry of Education to promote resilience. This is the reason that is given. We also read that money has been transferred from other ministries to budget items that actually belong to OCMW. So my question is, are ministries actually free to do this, or am I mistaken? If I am, I'd be happy to hear it. Chair, is it allowed during a budget year for ministries to allocate part of their budget to the domain of another department? Of course, it goes without saying that a reason can always be found for this. Why would a subject that, in principle, belongs on the budget of another department also be of interest to the department that is transferring the funds? In the example I just mentioned, for instance, Defense transferred 20 million euros to NWNO under the heading of resilience. And if that is correct, how does this relate, this is actually my question, to the budgetary rights of this chamber? Because isn't it odd if this chamber consciously chooses, for example, for political reasons, which is of course understandable, to allow the healthcare or education budget to grow, and then the ministries of VWS and OSRW during the budget year are subsequently free to do so? Apparently to transfer these additional funds, with a justification that of course can always be found, to organizational units that fall under the responsibility of other ministries. Chair, my second question is as follows. I read on page 58 that the interest payments confiscated by the EU, the European Union, on the frozen assets, Russian assets, are not being transferred to Ukraine as I had expected, but instead end up as so-called windfall profits in our defense budget. That amounts to 100 million euros in 2025. As compensation for the military support to Ukraine. Yes, of course we are against it, but that's not the focus of this debate right now. So my question is, why was this arrangement chosen? I don't really understand it. And why aren't the confiscated interest payments being transferred directly to Ukraine? Is the Netherlands, this is our question, by using this arrangement, not unnecessarily exposing itself to extra risk in the future of being held liable by Russia for the confiscation of these interest payments? And could this possibly also lead to the seizure of Dutch assets or property in Russia? So why are we taking this unnecessary extra risk? That would be my question to the Minister. Finally, Chairman, a third and final question about the incidental supplementary budget, with which just last week, right at the end of this fiscal year, a total of 700 million euros extra was allocated. This was released as military aid for Ukraine. Because there was underutilization, among other things, in this year's defense budget. This chamber, where the Minister of Defense asked for approval of this incidental budget within 48 hours. And if you then ask the Minister of Finance, how does the Minister of Finance view such use of an incidental budget? So also as the one responsible for the system. Why was this budget amendment not, for example, part of the Autumn Memorandum? And the reason that was given, that the claim that the contracts absolutely had to be signed last week instead of at the end of this week is, in our view, simply not credible. Because for such an amount, I think arms manufacturers can really wait another week for a contract. And even if, for this amount, a contract absolutely had to be signed last week, why couldn't this incidental budget, according to the Minister of Finance, have been sent to the House of Representatives earlier? So that we could have had a proper debate about it here, instead of being forced, because that's really what's happening, Chair, to sign on the dotted line within 48 hours. Because an underspending on the budget of no less than 700 million euros is certainly not nothing. And this is my question to the Minister of Finance. It doesn't necessarily only become apparent in the last few weeks of the fiscal year, does it? We've just discussed this extensively as well. There is a lot of underspending, especially in defense, so you can see it coming. That's how it can happen, that we're suddenly confronted with such a budget. And certainly not in the case of defense, where it's widely known that there is chronic underspending in the budget. So we should be able to expect from the Ministry of Defense, in the context of a proper budgeting process, something for which this minister is responsible, that they should be able to send this incidental budget to Parliament earlier. So why didn't that happen? What does the Minister of Finance think about this? And if the Minister agrees with us on this, is he willing to point out to his fellow ministers that incidental budgets, especially of this magnitude, which result from the allocation of funds that have become available due to underspending, and again, underspending that does not just happen out of nowhere, should, for example, be sent to the House of Representatives earlier through regular channels such as the Autumn Budget Memorandum? We look forward to the Minister's answers.
And Mr. Van Houwelingen also asked about this, and he asked, yes, what about the budgetary rights of the House? Well, that's exactly what we've tried to respect. Because we can't just spend the money as we please. It has to be submitted to your House through a budget, so that's an amendment to the second supplementary budget. That has been sent to your House, but it can never be authorized by the House of Representatives and the Senate within the time frame we're in if we want to act in accordance with the motion and spend the money to continue that support. So, in anticipation of the authorization of the budget, which I assume will be authorized since it is based on a motion, we have also had to invoke Article 2.27 of the Compatibility Act. An article that, in a previous role, I found myself using far too often, but which, of course, is necessary in this case. It provides the possibility to make expenditures in advance of approval by the House of Representatives. Article 2.27 has been tightened to prevent a cabinet from simply spending money on the basis of that article. The House must indicate whether the use of it, of 2.27, and the motivation underlying it, whether the House feels sufficiently informed about it, is sufficient. And your House has voted on this, and by majority, not Mr. Van Houwelingen, but the majority of the House has indicated we feel informed. The Cabinet can invoke Article 2.27 in anticipation of the authorization of the amendments to the second supplementary budget. And with that, the expenditures are also legitimate. This also prevents an instruction from the Court of Audit. This is, technically speaking, what has happened. This is what has happened. I have also heard Mr. Van Houwelingen's voting explanation. I believe he indicated that the House's budgetary rights were not being respected in this matter. But with these steps, it actually does comply with the budgetary rights, regardless of whether you agree with the expenditures. I also heard Mr. Van Houwelingen say that he has a different view on this.
Thank you, Chair. If I understand the Minister correctly, the Minister is saying, and that's correct regarding that, 700 million in additional support for Ukraine this year. We properly asked the House for permission for that. But as a House, we only had 2 days to sign off on it. My question is, because that was my question in the first round, so this comes from underspending, as I understand. But you don't just have 700 million euros lying around on the shelf. So couldn't we, as the House, have known about this earlier? That 700 million euros in underspending didn't just appear out of nowhere. That must have been known earlier, I assume.
Minister, no, well, that's always a bit tricky. When do you actually get a clear picture of that? You report on the underspending that we have identified. We report during the Autumn Budget Memorandum. For that, I depend on what the departments provide to me. I recognize that immediately. That's where I know that at the time of the Autumn Memorandum, I still don't have the complete picture because many departments also keep funds on their own budgets. Because they also think maybe I'll still have a setback at the end of the year, so I want to be able to use those funds if needed. So what you usually see in the financial annual report is actually this. Most of the underspending becomes apparent then. I think that needs to improve as well. So from my role as Minister of Finance, I always urge my colleagues to report any underspending they have so that we can also inform Parliament. But in that, I am dependent on my colleagues.
And then, very briefly, Chair, there are 2 more questions that weren't answered in the first round, but I'll quickly bring them up now. So, about the interest, that was my second question. Those interest payments, maybe you can briefly address that because I don't understand why that goes through our Dutch budget.
No, apologies, Chair. That question was indeed still pending. So, the European Commission has indeed skimmed off the interest payments on the Russian assets and made them available to the member states in order to provide military support to Ukraine. And the Netherlands has received 100 million for this on BIJ. And in the Autumn Budget Memorandum, it was again made available for additional support to Ukraine in 2025. So that's correct, Chair. The
question, Chair, was I understand that it's correct, but why does it go through our budget? Why isn't it? It's support for Ukraine, earned with all the associated risks, isn't it? I'm trying to explain it because Russia might later say, yes, you took that money, since Russia is, of course, disputing this. So why are we involving ourselves in this with our own budget? Why doesn't this go through legal channels? The money was for Ukraine. I don't understand.
The Minister, well, that was simply the agreement at the time. So first there was a political decision, also within the G7 and with the previous American administration, that we would use the interest earned on those frozen assets to benefit Ukraine. And purely for pragmatic reasons, it was decided at the time to channel it through the member state because that was the most straightforward way to provide the support.
So
beyond that, we don't really have much more to add.
I do think that puts us at risk, though. Finally, my last unanswered question. That concerned I was talking about that transfer from one ministry. That's how I read it, to the other ministry. Maybe you followed it during my first round? I don't think you've answered that yet either. Isn't it strange if we as Parliament say, for example, do you want extra money for education? I'm just giving an example here. Then I see in those notes that the Ministry of Education can say, well, we're going to transfer money, actually, to defense. And there's always some reason to deploy the military, but money is being moved there. Also in the autumn budget adjustments between ministries and with significant amounts too. How does that work? That was my question.
I'll get back to you in the second round about which specific adjustment you're referring to. But in general, yes, you can transfer money between budget chapters, also within budgets. But as long as this happens at the article level, whether within a budget or between budgets, it is up to your House and it is included in the budgetary notes. And then it is up to you, I say through the chair, to the House to authorize that. So you do indeed see the adjustment in the autumn budget memorandum in order to do justice to the budgetary rights of the House of Representatives. Very briefly, because you also asked about unanswered questions, you will get one more introduction.
Thank you for the collage, Chair. Yes, but I understand that. In the end, we are now receiving this autumn budget memorandum. So now we can either do it well or not. Of course, the money has already been spent. The problem I have with it is that we as the House, suppose we as the House say we want extra money for education. Well, maybe that will also appeal to the Chair. And then at a certain point, that money, apparently, because that's what you see happening now in this autumn budget memorandum, is actually transferred from the Ministry of Education to another ministry. In my view, for example, for other purposes. Those were the examples I just gave. Yes, of course, we could make quite a fuss about that here now, but then it's actually already too late because the money has already been spent. So isn't it really strange that money can just be transferred between ministries like that? Because that really surprised me.
The minister. Well, it can happen because it does happen. Your House has to authorize it. And if your House does not agree with it, we will also hear that in the debate. Or you can call the responsible minister to account for it. And if you say, yes, that money has already been spent, then the minister has a problem because they have done something without your authorization. But that's how it should be. It is part of the political interaction between the House and the Cabinet to debate such matters. I think the discomfort may be about the timing of this debate, the autumn budget memorandum, that. Of course, it's one day before the recess. So I would also be in favor of holding this debate a bit earlier in the future. You are, of course, in charge of the House's schedule, but then, as the House, you also have more opportunity to ask further questions and hold additional debates. The stuff will be in the room sooner. So